Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. Let me begin with a simple question. Uh, what happens when two of the world's most powerful nations, the United States and China, find themselves circling around a country that many in Washington would prefer to dismiss as small or insignificant? That country is Venezuela, and the answer is history begins to accelerate. Venezuela, long caught in the crossfire of global geopolitics, is now at the very center of a clash that could reshape U.S. China relations for the decade ahead. Venezuela is not just about oil, though oil is at the heart of this story. It possesses some of the largest proven reserves in the world. For the United States, Venezuela has long been viewed as part of its so-called backyard, the Western Hemisphere, where Washington seeks to dominate political outcomes. Yet for China, Venezuela represents opportunity, access to energy, new markets, and a diplomatic chance to challenge U.S. hegemony in Latin America. China's growing involvement in Venezuela is not just a matter of trade or simple diplomatic outreach. It is a deliberate and highly strategic move that reveals how Beijing intends to shape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, Latin America was regarded in Washington as its exclusive sphere of influence, a region where no other major power was allowed to play a decisive role. Yet today, that assumption is being tested in real time. China's calculated decision to deepen its ties with Venezuela is not only about gaining access to vital resources like oil, it is also about projecting influence into a region that the United States has historically considered off limits to competitors. This marks a profound geopolitical shift and one that deserves much closer attention than it often receives. Let us start with the obvious. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world. This fact alone makes it one of the most strategic countries in global energy politics. But here is the hook. Despite sitting atop this treasure, Venezuela's economy has been crippled by years of sanctions, mismanagement, and diplomatic isolation. While Washington sought to weaken the Venezuelan state through economic pressure, Beijing saw an opening. China has been extending loans to Caracas, sometimes in the tens of billions of dollars, often to be repaid in future oil shipments. This is not charity, it is strategic foresight. By locking in long-term supply deals, China ensures energy security for decades to come, while simultaneously strengthening an ally that stands in open defiance of U.S. policy. And here is where the story becomes even more compelling. China is not just providing financial lifelines, it is also investing in Venezuela's infrastructure, from telecommunications to transportation networks, embedding itself deeply into the daily functions of the state. Think about the symbolism. While U.S. sanctions seek to isolate Venezuela, Chinese technology is building its roads, its power plants, and even parts of its military communication systems. In effect, Beijing is rewriting the narrative. Far from being isolated, Venezuela is becoming a showcase for how China can step in when the United States shuts its doors. This is a message that resonates not only in Caracas, but across the entire global South. Consider the broader implications. For decades, Washington's influence in Latin America was maintained through a combination of economic leverage, security agreements, and political pressure. Yet in Venezuela, those tools are no longer working. The sanctions meant to suffocate the Maduro government have instead pushed it directly into the arms of Beijing. And with every new investment, every new trade deal, and every loan repayment in oil shipments, China is solidifying its foothold. This is not merely a side story. It is a dramatic reshaping of the regional order. The very idea that the United States could claim Latin America as its backyard is being undermined. But the hook goes even deeper. China's engagement is about more than Venezuela itself. By defending Venezuela through economic and diplomatic support, Beijing is sending a message to other nations. If Washington turns its back on you, we will step in. If the United States imposes sanctions, we can provide alternatives. This narrative is enormously powerful for countries that have long felt trapped under Western financial systems. It signals the emergence of a new option, one that challenges the old world order. What makes this so striking is how overt it has become. China is no longer hiding its interest in Latin America. State media openly highlight the win-win partnership with Venezuela, framing it as a model of South cooperation. In contrast, the United States continues to frame Venezuela primarily as a problem, an adversary to be contained, a regime to be toppled. Here we see two competing visions, one of punishment and exclusion, and the other of investment and inclusion, even if highly self-interested. And that contrast is not lost on the Venezuelan people or on neighboring countries watching closely. At the heart of this story is a question that should make us pause. Is China simply acting as a rival superpower, seeking its own influence at America's expense? Or is it tapping into something deeper, a global hunger for alternatives to U.S. hegemony? Venezuela, in this sense, becomes more than a single country's struggle. It becomes a stage where China can demonstrate how its rise is altering the global balance. That is why Beijing's role is not incidental, but fundamental to understanding the future of Latin America's political economy and the broader clash between two world powers. Washington's strategy toward Venezuela over the past decade has been built on the premise that maximum pressure would break the political order in Caracas, undermine Nicolás Maduro's hold on power, and restore a government more aligned with U.S. interests. Yet what has unfolded is precisely the opposite. Instead of collapsing under economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation, Venezuela has become more resilient by forging deeper partnerships with alternative powers, especially China and Russia. This outcome is not accidental. It is the predictable consequence of a policy that underestimated Venezuela's capacity to adapt and overestimated Washington's ability to coerce outcomes in the 21st century. The hook is clear in trying to weaken Venezuela. The United States has accelerated the very geopolitical realignment it most fears. Economic sanctions were designed to strangle Venezuela's oil-dependent economy, depriving the government of its primary source of revenue and forcing political concessions. But here lies the irony. While sanctions sharply reduced Caracas's access to Western markets and financial systems, they also compelled the government to look elsewhere for survival. China quickly emerged as a lifeline, offering credit lines, energy deals, and infrastructure investments. Russia stepped in with military cooperation and additional energy partnerships. Far from being isolated, Venezuela built new channels of support, finding in these relationships not only resources, but also legitimacy on the international stage. Sanctions meant to close doors, open new ones. What makes this turn of events especially striking is how sanctions have affected the Venezuelan population. Ordinary citizens have borne the brunt of economic collapse, shortages of medicine, soaring inflation, and a collapsing currency. These hardships were supposed to turn public opinion decisively against Maduro. Yet in practice, the narrative shifted. The government framed the crisis as evidence of U.S. aggression, portraying itself as a victim of imperial bullying. Many Venezuelans, even those critical of the government, came to see the sanctions less as a path to democracy and more as collective punishment. And in this climate, Maduro's leadership did not wither, it hardened. The hook is subbering rather than undermining his regime. Sanctions helped Maduro reposition himself as a nationalist figure standing up to a foreign power. At the geopolitical level, the backfiring of U.S. policy reveals a much larger dilemma. In an interconnected world where global powers are eager to expand their influence, sanctions no longer guarantee isolation. Instead, they often push targeted states into the embrace of rival powers. This is precisely what has happened in Venezuela. Washington's insistence on maximum pressure created a vacuum, and Beijing and Moscow filled it with ease. As a result, the U.S. is no longer dealing solely with Venezuela. It is facing a network of alliances that makes any unilateral strategy far less effective. The hook here is undeniable. In attempting to weaken a single government, Washington has inadvertently strengthened a coalition of its global competitors. Consider the symbolic power of this outcome. Every time China delivers financial support or Russia announces new military cooperation with Caracas, it is a visible reminder that U.S. power is not absolute. For countries across Latin America and beyond, the Venezuelan case has become a demonstration that there are alternatives to Washington's dictates. This matters profoundly because it undermines the credibility of U.S. leadership in regions it once dominated without challenge. Venezuela is no longer just a country in crisis. It is a showcase of how U.S. pressure can be outmaneuvered by the rise of multipolarity. The human dimension of this story should not be forgotten either. Millions of Venezuelans have emigrated in search of stability and opportunity, creating one of the largest refugee crises in the hemisphere. Washington's sanctions, by worsening economic conditions, have contributed to this outflow, further destabilizing neighboring states. Yet here again, the Maduro government has exploited the situation, blaming Washington for the suffering while portraying Chinese and Russian assistance acts of solidarity. For many in the global South, this narrative resonates. The image of the United States punishing and China rescuing, however simplistic, is gaining traction. The deeper lesson is that coercion without diplomacy rarely produces lasting change. By refusing to engage, Washington surrendered the possibility of influencing Venezuela's internal evolution. Beijing and Moscow, in contrast, chose engagement and investment even at a cost. And in this gamble, they have secured something far greater than oil or contracts. They have secured political influence in the U.S. historical backyard. The hook, then, is that Washington's strategy intended to assert dominance has instead revealed the limits of that dominance in a rapidly shifting global order. Oil has always been at the center of Venezuela's story, and in many ways, it is both its greatest strength and its deepest vulnerability. Possessing the largest proven reserves of crude oil on the planet, Venezuela holds a resource that every major power covets. Yet the paradox is striking. Despite this immense wealth beneath its soil, the nation has suffered one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. Here lies the hook. Oil is not just a commodity in Venezuela, it is the weapon, the bargaining chip, and the very battlefield on which the United States, China, and other powers are struggling for influence. Whoever secures a foothold in Venezuela's oil sector gains far more than revenue. They gain leverage over the global energy order. For decades, Venezuela's oil tied it closely to the United States. U.S. refineries were among the largest buyers of Venezuelan crude. And for Washington, that arrangement guaranteed both proximity and control. But the sanctions regime and years of political hostility severed that relationship. When the U.S. closed its doors, China saw an opening. Beijing's demand for energy is nearly insatiable, driven by the needs of its vast economy. By securing Venezuelan oil, often through long-term repayment agreements on loans, China was not just purchasing energy, it was embedding itself deeply into Venezuela's economic lifeline. Every shipment of crude eastward represents more than fuel for China's industries. It represents a strategic reorientation of Venezuela's economic future away from Washington and toward Beijing. The strategic importance of Venezuela's oil lies not only in its abundance, but also in its geopolitical symbolism. In a world where energy remains the lifeblood of economies and militaries, control over reserves translates into political influence. The United States knows this. It has long built foreign policy around securing access to global energy supplies. But the entry of China into this arena changes the equation. Instead of one dominant buyer dictating terms, Venezuela now has alternatives. This diminishes U.S. leverage dramatically. The hook is sharp. Sanctions that were meant to choke Venezuela's oil exports forced the very diversification that freed Caracas from Washington's grasp. What makes the oil question even more compelling is its connection to global markets. Venezuela's crude is heavy and requires specialized refining. The United States had the refineries to process it. China initially did not, yet necessity drove innovation. Over the years, China has adapted, investing in refining capabilities and alternative channels to absorb Venezuelan supply. This technical shift underscores how Beijing views Venezuelan oil not as a short-term gamble, but as a long-term pillar of its energy security. And in that commitment, Caracas finds a partner willing to endure hardship where Washington offers only pressure. Oil also plays a central role in shaping Venezuela's domestic politics. Revenue from oil exports funds government programs, sustains social spending, and underpins the survival of the political system. When sanctions targeted the oil industry, the aim was to weaken this foundation and erode support for Maduro. But again, China's role complicated the outcome by offering new markets and facilitating exports through indirect channels. Beijing ensured that Venezuela's oil continued to generate revenue. It may not have been at the scale of earlier decades, but it was enough to keep the government afloat. The hook here is that oil, once the tool Washington used to maintain dominance, has become the shield Venezuela uses to resist it. The competition over Venezuelan oil is not happening in isolation. It is unfolding against the backdrop of broader shifts in global energy politics. As nations debate the transition to renewable energy, fossil fuels still command immense strategic importance. For China, securing long-term oil supplies while investing simultaneously in renewables represents a dual-track strategy, meeting today's needs while preparing for tomorrow. For the United States, losing influence over the world's largest reserves is not just a commercial loss, it is a blow to its geopolitical standing. Venezuela, therefore, is not merely a player in the oil market. It is a stage where the future of energy geopolitics is being rehearsed. There is also a psychological dimension to this struggle. For the United States, watching Venezuelan oil flow eastward instead of northward is a constant reminder that its dominance in the hemisphere is no longer assured. For China, each tanker leaving Venezuelan shores represents proof that it can challenge U.S. Power even in regions far from its traditional sphere of influence. And for Venezuela, oil has become the symbol of survival, proof that despite sanctions, isolation, and economic collapse, it remains relevant on the world stage because its resources cannot be ignored. The hook that emerges is stark and powerful. Oil is no longer just fueling engines. It is fueling a new global rivalry. Venezuela, a country of only 30 million people, holds a resource that magnifies its significance far beyond its borders. In the contest between the United States and China, oil is not simply a commodity, it is the currency of power, the trigger of alliances, and the spark that could ignite broader confrontations in the years to come. The clash over Venezuela is not only about oil sanctions or the survival of one government, it is a reflection of a much deeper transformation underway in the international system. For much of the past 3 decades, the United States has operated under the assumption of a unipolar world, one in which it set the rules and others were compelled to follow. But today, that model is eroding, and Venezuela has become one of the clearest examples of the shift toward a multipolar world. The hook is simple yet profound. What looks like a regional dispute is, in fact, a stage on which the future of global order is being contested. For Washington, Venezuela has always been more than just another Latin American nation. It is a test case of whether the United States can still enforce its will in what it considers its own hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, though formally outdated, still casts a long shadow in U.S. strategic thinking. Latin America should remain firmly under U.S. influence. Yet China's bold entrance into Venezuela upends this logic. By providing investments, loans, and diplomatic backing, Beijing signals that Latin America is no longer a closed arena, but part of a global chessboard where multiple powers now have a role. This is not just about economics, it is about rewriting the geography of influence. The emergence of multipolarity becomes clearer when we observe the resilience of Venezuela despite relentless U.S. pressure. Under a unipolar order, sanctions and isolation would have likely succeeded in forcing political change. But in a multipolar system, targeted states can turn to alternative patrons. Venezuela has done exactly that. China provides financial and technological support. Russia adds military cooperation and intelligence sharing. Turkey facilitates trade, and even Iran supplies oil in defiance of U.S. sanctions. The web of relationships that sustains Caracas is a visible demonstration of how power now operates distributed, diversified, and no longer controlled by a single hegemon. The hook here is that Venezuela is not merely surviving, it is surviving because the world has moved beyond Washington's monopoly. This new reality extends beyond Latin America, around the globe, from Africa to Central Asia to the Middle East. Nations are finding themselves courted by multiple great powers rather than just one. The Venezuelan case illustrates the options available to countries under pressure. They can diversify their alliances and balance between competing poles. For Washington, this is deeply frustrating as its traditional toolkit of sanctions and diplomatic isolation is no longer sufficient. For Beijing and Moscow, however, it is an opportunity to project themselves as defenders of sovereignty and alternatives to U.S. dominance. Each deal signed in Caracas, each tanker rerouted to Asia, each statement of support at the United Nations is not just about Venezuela. It is about announcing a new international logic. The psychological dimension of multipolarity is equally important. For decades, smaller nations lived under the assumption that crossing Washington came with unbearable costs. Yet Venezuela demonstrates that with the backing of other powers, those costs can be mitigated. This lesson is not lost on other governments. From Cuba to Iran to even some African states, the Venezuelan experience is being watched closely as a guide for how to navigate U.S. hostility in a world with more than one pole of power. The hook is striking Venezuela has unintentionally become a beacon, showing that survival outside the U.S. orbit is possible in the new global order. The U.S.-China confrontation over Venezuela also underscores the competing narratives of global politics. Washington continues to frame the struggle as a defense of democracy and human rights, casting Maduro as an illegitimate autocrat. Beijing, by contrast, speaks the language of sovereignty, non-interference, and mutual benefit. These narratives matter because they shape a global perceptions of legitimacy. And in much of the global South, China's framing resonates more strongly than Washington's. For nations long weary of U.S. interventions and conditionalities, the promise of respectful partnership carries great appeal. Even if China's own motives are strategic, the hook is that Venezuela is not just being defended, it is being used to tell a story, one in which U.S. dominance is outdated and multipolarity is the future. At its core, the Venezuelan case is about more than energy or ideology. It is about whether the 21st century will be defined by one superpower or by many. Every oil shipment to China, every loan repayment structured outside the dollar system, every international declaration of support for Caracas adds another layer to the multipolar framework. The more Venezuela resists under the shelter of multiple patrons, the clearer it becomes that unipolarity is no longer enforceable. And the world is watching. The hook that lingers is powerful. Venezuela may seem like a small country on the map, but in the struggle between unipolarity and multipolarity, it has become a symbol far larger than itself. Its survival represents the cracks in an old order and the birth pangs of a new one where no single power writes the rules, and every power must compete for influence on a more equal playing field. History has shown us time and again that when great powers collide over smaller nations, the consequences often extend far beyond the borders of the country at the center of the dispute. Venezuela is no exception. On the surface, it might appear to be a local crisis, an internal political struggle compounded by economic decline. But beneath that surface lies the potential for escalation into a far broader confrontation, one that could draw in multiple powers and unsettle international peace. The hook here is both sobering and urgent. Venezuela may look like a regional dispute, yet it carries the seeds of a global conflict if the tensions between Washington and Beijing spiral unchecked. When the United States imposes sanctions and increases pressure, it does not act in a vacuum. Every new round of sanctions against Caracas reverberates in Beijing and Moscow, where policymakers interpret U.S. actions not as neutral enforcement of norms, but as aggressive moves to extend dominance. This interpretation compels them to respond, often by tightening their own support for Venezuela. China expands its credit lines or secures oil shipments, while Russia provides military advisors, equipment, and intelligence sharing. Each of these actions, while framed as defensive, deepens the divide between Washington and its rivals. The very policies intended to isolate Venezuela instead risk entrenching a proxy conflict. The hook becomes clear. Venezuela has shifted from being an isolated state in crisis to a potential flashpoint where great powers test each other's resolve. Escalation rarely happens in sudden leaps. It often unfolds in incremental steps that seem manageable until they converge into something uncontrollable. Already, we see signs of this incrementalism in the Venezuelan crisis. The U.S. Maintains naval patrols in the Caribbean under the banner of counter narcotics operations, yet their presence also serves as a projection of force. Russia, in turn, has conducted joint exercises with Venezuela and even flown military aircraft to the region, signaling its willingness to challenge U.S. dominance directly in America's own hemisphere. China, while more cautious militarily, has anchored its influence through economic entrenchment so deep that challenging Venezuela means indirectly challenging Beijing's long-term interests. Each of these moves raises the stakes, turning a local dispute into a multi-layered geopolitical contest. The risk of escalation also emerges through misperception. Great powers often misinterpret each other's actions, reading defensive measures as offensive threats. A U.S. show of force designed to signal deterrence might be read in Moscow or Beijing as preparation for intervention. A Chinese infrastructure deal framed as development cooperation may be viewed in Washington as a foothold for strategic control. These misinterpretations create a dangerous cycle where each side reacts to the worst assumptions about the other. The hook is unsettling. Venezuela could easily become the site of a misunderstanding that spirals into a confrontation no one intended, but few can control. Beyond the direct actors, escalation in Venezuela threatens to destabilize the wider region. Neighboring countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Guyana are already affected by the economic and humanitarian fallout of Venezuela's crisis. Millions of Venezuelans have fled, straining regional stability. If U.S. China rivalry intensifies, these nations will be forced to take sides, further polarizing the hemisphere. And here lies another hook. Regional alliances could fracture under the pressure of choosing between Washington and Beijing, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond Caracas. Latin America as a whole could become another arena where the battle lines of a multipolar world are drawn. Global markets are also part of the escalation dynamic. Oil, the lifeblood of Venezuela's economy, is not just a resource, but a geopolitical trigger. Disruptions to Venezuelan supply, whether through sanctions or conflict, ripple through energy markets worldwide. Rising prices, shortages, or sudden shifts in supply chains can inflame tensions between powers already struggling with inflation and economic instability. Thus, what begins as a local oil dispute can quickly transform into a global economic crisis. The hook here is that Venezuela's oil reserves, rather than stabilizing its economy, could serve as the accelerant of wider geopolitical conflict. The larger danger lies in the precedent this crisis could set. If the United States insists on unilateral dominance and China continues to defend Venezuela as a sovereign partner, other states will watch closely and adjust their own behavior. Smaller nations under pressure may feel emboldened to resist U.S. demands, believing Beijing will step in. Washington, unwilling to accept such defiance, may double down on pressure. This dynamic sets the stage for a world in which more local disputes become theaters for global rivalry. Venezuela then is not just about Caracas and Washington. It is about a pattern of escalation that could replicate itself elsewhere. The hook that should not be ignored is this: the Venezuelan crisis is not frozen in place. It is dynamic, and the longer it persists, the more likely it becomes a spark for something much larger. If history teaches us anything, it is that great power rivalries often ignite not in the capitals of the powerful, but in the struggles of smaller nations caught in between. Venezuela has now become one such struggle, a pressure point where the risk of escalation looms over every diplomatic move, every military exercise, and every shipment of oil that leaves its shores. The deeper meaning of the U.S. China confrontation over Venezuela lies not in the immediate question of who defends whom, but in the broader dilemma of whether the world's two leading powers can transcend zero sum rivalry and cooperate on global challenges. Venezuela is an important test case, but it also points us towards something larger. The hook here is undeniable. Behind the battles over oil, sanctions, and political legitimacy lurks the question of whether Washington and Beijing will choose escalation or cooperation. And that choice could shape the international system for decades. On one level, Venezuela represents a clash of interests. The United States seeks to weaken a government it considers authoritarian and illegitimate, while China aims to strengthen a partner that provides access to vital resources and stands as a symbol of resistance to U.S. dominance. But step back and the stakes broaden. Both countries face challenges that transcend borders: climate change, pandemics, global poverty, and technological transformation. These are not problems that can be solved through confrontation. Yet every ounce of political capital spent in proxy struggles like Venezuela reduces the bandwidth available for cooperation on issues that truly determine humanity's future. The hook is sharp while Washington and Beijing duel over Caracas. The planet itself edges closer to crises that neither can solve alone. This raises the fundamental question of priorities. If Venezuela becomes another arena of endless confrontation, what message does that send to the rest of the world? Smaller nations, especially in the global south, will conclude that their struggles will always be subordinated to great power gamesmanship rather than addressed in their own right. They will also see that Washington and Beijing, instead of uniting to tackle global inequality or climate pressures, are locked in zero-sum contests that reduce cooperation to almost nothing. This perception is dangerous because it undermines the legitimacy of both powers as leaders of a global order. The hook here is unsettling. The real cost of the Venezuelan standoff may not be borne by Caracas alone, but by the credibility of the U.S. and China as global problem solvers. The contrast in narratives is striking. Washington frames Venezuela as a battle for democracy, while Beijing frames it as a defense of sovereignty. But the deeper narrative observed from afar is that both powers are locked in rivalry while urgent global issues worsen. Imagine the symbolism at international summits when world leaders should be hammering out agreements on carbon emissions or pandemic preparedness. Attention is diverted to proxy conflicts over oil shipments in the Caribbean. The Venezuelan case thus risks becoming a microcosm of the larger dysfunction in global governance. The hook is clear: if the world's strongest nations cannot cooperate, even on issues of shared survival, then humanity faces a far more perilous century. Yet there is also opportunity embedded within the crisis. Venezuela could become a stage not for conflict, but for dialogue. If Washington and Beijing were willing to experiment with cooperation instead of confrontation. joint humanitarian aid programs, coordinated energy policies, or trilateral development projects could turn Venezuela into a case study in conflict resolution rather than great power escalation. The chances of this happening may be slim, but the symbolic impact would be enormous. It would show the world that the U.S. and China can put aside rivalry when it matters most. The hook here is hopeful. The same country that today symbolizes division could tomorrow become the proof that cooperation is still possible. The Venezuelan struggle also underscores the shifting expectations of the international community. Many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are no longer willing to accept a world defined by one dominant power. They want options, flexibility, and a say in their own future. For them, the question is not whether China will defend Venezuela or whether the U.S. will challenge Beijing, but whether the great powers will respect their sovereignty while still addressing the shared crises that bind us all. Venezuela, thus, becomes a mirror reflecting the desires of much of the world: independence, respect, and cooperation on global challenges. The hook that emerges is powerful. This is not just about Venezuela, it is about the kind of world order that billions of people now demand. Ultimately, the Venezuelan case forces us to confront a paradox. The United States and China both recognize, at least rhetorically, the need for cooperation on global issues. Yet their behavior in Caracas reflects the opposite: rivalry, escalation, and mutual suspicion. If this contradiction continues, the world may face a future where cooperation on climate, health, and development remains perpetually hostage to local confrontations. That is the danger. But there is also the possibility that Venezuela could serve as the wake-up call, the reminder that rivalry carries enormous costs while cooperation carries enormous potential. The hook that lingers is this: in every Venezuelan oil tanker, every sanction, every diplomatic maneuver. The deeper question is not who wins in Caracas. It is whether Washington and Beijing can ever learn to win together on the global stage.